You know how people are addicted to social media? I'm essentially addicted to Goodreads as my social media. And so today we're going to talk about like 20 books on biology. Let's check it out. Okay. Talking about molecular biology of the cell. This book is a beast. This book is a total beast. I've never read it, but I've heard it's a beast. And this was like the book that kickstarted molecular biology and cell biology as a field. And here's Michael Nielsen, who's this amazing polymouth on the internet, saying his favorite book of the year was Molecular Biology of the Cell. He says, MBOTC is a more remarkable book. It transformed how I see the world. I began to appreciate just how rich and remarkable biology is. I'm not sure how much time I spent with it, dozens of hours, maybe more. Mostly as a background for this piece on AI and science. He could probably spend hundreds of hours with it as part of creative projects. Amazing, amazing, amazing. So that book's great. However, there's a changing of the seas here. Laura Deming, another amazing biologist, says, I've transferred my allegiance from molecular biology of the cell to the book bionumbers.org. This is my new Bible for aspiring molecular biology learners, and you should check it out. Sorry, MBOC, I still love you. Yeah, I mean, this book's amazing. You can see this 2 years ago, I was like, oh my God, yes, I agree. BioNumbers is so good. BioNumbers is this great thing called Cell Biology by the Numbers. It's kind of a book, but it's also just like a website. So check out this website. So there's the book, but then the book just exists as a website because we're in the future. And you can see there's all these amazing things. You can look at the size and geometry of cells and how big are viruses and how big is a human cell and all these little questions that you can ask. And so, what are the different rates of everything? How long does stuff take? How fast are things? So it just really gives you, I think of it as getting kind of the first steps towards an AI view of a cell, where you get to understand the quantitative view on how much stuff is there? Are there 100 mitochondria? Are there 1,000 mitochondria? Are there a trillion mitochondria? So this book is crucial for that. And you can see one of my favorite things here is what is the macromolecular composition of the cell? It has this great image of what a cell is made out of. And you can see here, it's mostly protein. 55% of a cell is protein. All those little workhorses doing stuff. A good amount of it are all these, just a little bit is DNA. So there's a little bit of DNA, remembering what to do. Then there's rRNA and 13S and 16S. That's the ribosome. So there's so much ribosome in there. And the tRNA are the transfer RNAs that happen to pull stuff to be like, what should I build from the ribosome? And the mRNAs are the messenger RNAs that are feeding stuff into the ribosome to the 3D printer. So that's the RNA. And then there's also the lipids, the cell wall, peptidoglycan and lipidosaccharides, part of the cell wall. And then these little glycogen is the energy for these cells. And then metabolites are things like Krebs cycle things. So this just gives you such a beautiful view on biology. Okay, now we can start to talk about another great inspiration for books, which is Michael Levin, another polymath, really smart dude. When I was asking Twitter recently for, I guess 2 years ago, for how do cells work? He was like, here's some of my books about foundational biosciences. And so there are so many good ones in here. And yes, I want to kind of highlight a few of them. So the first is Wetware. This is an awesome book, A Computer in Every Living Cell. This was written 2004, pretty early on, maybe 2008. It was like, hey, how are bacteria and cells, how do they actually do computation? And when you dive into them, you can really understand. You can say, oh, here's this little thing. It has 10,000 sensors on it to understand how many toxins are in the environment, how much sugar's in the environment. And then it can use these little chemotaxis to go towards them. And then once it has that, it can bring them into itself. And then it has these signaling cascades. And so the whole thing is just this amazing, beautiful piece of, it's using, the computer as a metaphor to understand the software of cells. Then you have Evolution in 4 Dimensions, which is a great book on the extended evolutionary synthesis. And you can see Ava Jablonka here, who's a famous person within this field. She says there's genetic, epigenetic, behavioral, and symbolic variation in the history of life. So instead of just being a gene maximalist and a genotype maximalist, you can expand out and say, wait, are there other ways that stuff gets transferred down through time? It's like, yeah, obviously. And here's a great picture that shows, that more stuff gets transferred down. The top left is the first population, the bottom right is the second population. And so you can see here's the GC, these are the genes. And the genes do get passed down. That's normal. That's number one here. That's what we know of. Pass down your genes. But the other thing that gets passed down is the adult above you can pass down things epigenetically to you. This is, mother's smoke or whatever. And then their histones, which are like the things that hold some of the DNA, those can change, unravel or to tighten up. And that can then lead to negative outcomes for their kids. Yeah, so we have epigenetics that get passed down. And then finally, the bodies, adults can pass things down to each other behaviorally. I pass down, we are born into a sea, into a knowledge pool, a meme pool of behaviors and things, and we pass those down. I learned so much from my mom and dad around how to be in the world because we have these conformist tendencies. And then finally, number 4 is the other crazy thing that gets passed down is the environment. And so, yeah, you get passed down not only behaviors, but also I was born in Denver and we were born into a world of climate change. And so evolution is not just genetic inheritance and genetic replication. There's so much more gets passed down. Here's another great book from Michael Levin, The Arrival of the Fittest by Andreas Wagner. A pretty recent book, 2014-ish maybe, and maybe 2021. And those are 2 different dates, but whatever. He's part of the extended evolutionary synthesis people. If you think about evolution as the selection of inherited variation, he's thinking about, okay, we know that evolution, that Darwinian selection, it's pretty good at the selection piece, where once you have a bunch of phenotypes, then you can do selection on them to get the next set of genotypes. And what Andreas is saying is, how do you even get those phenotypes in the first place? We know about the survival of the fittest. What are we dealt? What are the hands that are dealt here? And so he really dives into a bunch of cool things around variation, what's called evolvability, where the systems that we have in place, when you think about the selection of inherited variation, there's the selection piece, but then there's the inheritance piece of genotypes, but then there's also variation. And so you can say, what's happening to variation over time? And what we thought initially was that variation was random and in all directions. And what we've learned is over time, certain things are frozen in the code and certain things change. Yes, there's a cool book on variation and evolvability. This is the final recent book that made Michael Levin's list, that also Tyler Cowen did a great recent interview with this guy, Philip Ball. And this is a 2025 book, maybe 2024, A User's Guide to the New Biology. It's mostly about how life is complicated. It's moving further into the systems biology, extended evolutionary synthesis frame, and looks at how DNA is not just a code for what we build, but rather a toolkit that then we can use. And so, for example, for something like us, we have this toolkit, and then if you happen to be born in the mountains, in our Sherpa or whatever, then that toolkit is optimizing you a little bit more for oxygen intake and things like that. And so our genes are more of a toolkit than a blueprint. Okay, now let's talk about microbiology and kind of some popular books around that. This first one is amazing. Ed Yong, total baller, total beast. It's called I Contain Multitudes, The Microbes Within Us and a Grander View of Life. What it tells you is, Ed Yong's whole thing is like, hey, actually, I contain multitudes. Half of the cells in our bodies have the 40 trillion human cells, and we have 40 trillion microbial cells, our microbiome and everything. And that's true for us, but it's true for all animals and all plants and everything. And that we're built fundamentally, if you think about life on Earth, been around 4 billion years, the first 3.5 billion, the first 7/8 was all small life. And so we were built into a world of small life. And therefore, all the pathogens that are around us, our microbiome, so that when you look out into the world, you should see a world of microbes. And this is another book for popular audiences called The Song of the Cell, An Exploration of Medicine and the New Human by Siddhartha Mukherjee. A great book, beast of a book. He also wrote The Gene. And this book is about cells and cells, how cool cells are. It's a classic narrative nonfiction. So it looks at over time, how did we start to see cells? And Robert Hooke's Micrographia, 1655 or whatever, when he was like, oh my God, we have a microscope, everything, there's so much down here. We were like, oh my God, there's so many small things. That's crazy. Maybe there's even smaller things. Then we learned about the atom and stuff. And then we started to look at, and so from the perspective of medicine, it looks at how we started in 1800-ish or whatever. We're like, okay, it's mostly anatomy. Things are mostly organs. And then we were like, wait a second, we have organs are made of tissues and tissues are made of cells. And what's happening in cells? And then we could start thinking about the world in terms of the organelles going wrong, not just organs going wrong. And that's the way we look at things today, where we say, oh my God, what's going on with your body? You don't just bleed yourself out and say, well, that was too bad. You look at small little things that are happening within your heart, within your cells, not just organs. And it also allowed us to look at cells out there in the world and to think about pathogens. There's a great passage in this book around John Snow in England and, 1850s with the typhoid epidemic, and being like, whoa, it looks like, I think there are these little creatures and that's what's killing everybody. Now getting to things in today, this is 2 good books on Jennifer Doudna and CRISPR. The first one is The Codebreaker by Walter Isaacson. And then before this, Jennifer also wrote her own book called A Crack in Creation. And yeah, these are 2 cool books. The creation of CRISPR and also things that might go wrong or right with it. We're starting to get the first gene therapies that are CRISPR. And so we're able to fix sickle cell anemia by turning the thing that turns turned off fetal hemoglobin, you just turn off the thing that turns off. So you turn it back on. You say, actually, you're allowed to have, instead of these bad sickle cells and bad hemoglobin, you can have the fetus hemoglobin. Let's turn that on. And so we're doing that. It's $1 million to do it, but it's a curative. It cures it for life. And so that is just the start of these CRISPR things. We're doing it obviously with personalized diseases too, where you can just turn off one little gene within yourself. And we're doing it with plants and animals as well. And those are kind of easier to do ethically because you know you can do all these experiments with them and not have all the downsides with humans. Okay, let's talk about pathogens now. And you got to start with COVID. You know, Michael Lewis, The Premonition, a pandemic story. And this is, just like almost a political economy and how US responded to COVID. Then you have something like Pathogenesis, which is a history of the world in 8 plagues. I think this is a cool book because, you can really look at history and say, wait a second, why did the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens, what happened there? Oh my God. Why did Athens lose? A third of Athens died in a plague? Okay, that's interesting. What happened in the year 200? Oh, there's a big Roman plague, and that definitely the downfall of the Roman Empire. And then 500 CE, you had this huge plague of Justinian. This was essentially the Black Plague, but 1,000 years earlier, and that took down the Byzantine Empire. And then the modern world, in some ways, a function of the Black Death, where you had the Mongols brought it over to the West, to Europe. The Black Death killed a third of the people. A third to half of the people, which is crazy in like a very short time period, like a decade. And then that created pressure on labor where there wasn't enough labor, so it could push back against the state. And that led to the scientific revolution and then the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. So I think this is it's kind of a classic, like one big theory book. Here's a classic, amazing Our World in Data image of some of these pandemics. The Black Death is one. I totally forgot to talk about the Columbian Exchange, which is the weirdest name for, killing roughly 90% of the population. When Europe came over to America. And then obviously these modern pandemics, so much of our modern time are these cholera pandemics, the typhoid pandemics. And then the modern, the Spanish flu is huge. And then the HIV/AIDS epidemic was obviously bad. And then COVID. We love COVID. Here's another great history of pandemics. This is a different way to see it. Here's the plague of Justinian that I was talking about. There's the Black Death. Here's smallpox. That's the Columbian Exchange. And then these more recent, Spanish flu, HIV/AIDS, and COVID. Now this book, who remembers reading this book in school? I remember reading this in 9th grade and it was crazy. It was like, oh my God, Ebola, what's going on? People were dying and stuff. I think this book encouraged George Bush to create some of the pandemic preparedness stuff maybe. I don't know, very cool. And then you have some modern bangers. John Green, Everything is Tuberculosis. He's doing good work. And, tuberculosis still kills. It was eliminated in the West. It used to be like half of people in America died from tuberculosis, or like a third. And now no one does. But it still kills it's like 1 million people a year, something like that. It's one of the worst infectious diseases. And so that's mostly a political choice where we're just allowing this thing to still kill tons of people. So great book. And I think it's just cool the work that John Green is doing to try to help tuberculosis go away. Now you can get to some other biology books that are just classic bangers. There's a bunch of Dawkins books that are super good. My favorite is The Selfish Gene. I love The Extended Phenotype too. Great idea. But The Selfish Gene, his first book, which I think I love, 1976, it was his book. It's short. It's like 200 pages. Coming into the world, and he was like, oh my God, I'm thinking about stuff. I'm reading about, we had just learned about genes, and now I'm going to think in terms of replicators, these little genes, and then the vehicles are just us. Something like a blue whale is just a really big vehicle for the very small genetic code within it, and then inserts the genetic code into another whole body. And the whole goal of that whole body is just to replicate this tiny little thing. So very cool idea. Great analogies around genes as a deck of cards and genes as a bunch of rowers that are working in combination with each other, that the genes keep on seeing each other through time and they start to work collaboratively. And then one of the most important parts of this book is that came up with the idea of the meme, that there's a different kind of replicator within cultural fabrics that ideas and mind viruses can replicate within us. Nick Lane, you got to put some Nick Lane books on here too. I love The Vital Question. This book's also amazing. Life Ascending, the 10 Great Inventions of Evolution, looks at things like sex and blood and why they were invented. So it's a great classic Nick Lane book. Totally recommend it. And then you can think about, well, what about these other creatures out there? Trying to understand trees, trying to understand and get away from the self and be like, okay, there's all this microbial world that's important, but also trees. What's going on with trees? They can sense things in the environment. They have these microbiome, their own mycorrhizal networks. They're very cool, and this book does a great job of explaining them. Then there's the entangled life, which does a similar thing, but for fungi, which may be even crazier. And then finally, for stuff like animals, this is a great book by Sean B. Carroll, who is one of the main Evo-Devo people. And so he's looking at, we have gene regulation. And you're like, wait a second. And so when we got multicellularity, we said, well, what are all the different ways that you can combine stuff together to make these big creatures? It was like, okay, there's plants, which do photosynthesis. There's fungi, which kind of, they don't move, but they just digest stuff that's around them. And then you got animals, and animals are going to move a lot. They're going to consume the oxygen that all these plants are putting out. Maybe they'll eat some plants. And then we're going to, let's explore all these different body plans. Wow, you can be a worm. You can be a jellyfish. You can be arachnid. You can be, a vertebrate. Wow, what is this vertebrate like? So we looked at all these different body plans, both radial symmetry, stuff like starfishes, but also bilateral symmetry like us, humans, and vertebrates. And then we're like, well, what kind of vertebrates are there? And then we're like, well, you got fish, you got amphibians, you got reptiles, you got birds, and you got mammals. Because you're like, okay, this thing seems to be working out, this whole bilateral symmetry thing. What are all the different ways to do that? You can be in the water, you can be in the air. And so this book does a great job of explaining how our transcription factor networks and our Hox genes networks and the gene regulatory system essentially takes all these ways that you can be an animal, and that life found a way to experiment with body plans without killing the creature. And 2 final books here. I mostly read my books on Kindle, but I buy some of them in person. And one of them is The Machinery of Life by David Goodsell, who I've chatted with on the phone, who's great. He kind of kickstarted these books that show the inside of cells. Look at that. He illustrates them all himself, which is crazy. And so this is a little bacteria. And you can see its little flagella here, and then you can also see inside it. So, look at this. He's showing here, he's like, okay, here's this bacterial flagellar motor. It's doing its motor thing to spin the flagella, blah, 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 blah. And here's all the proteins in here, and here's some DNA and RNA. And he draws every little thing in the book in this amazing color. So really cool book, 2010-ish. And then of course, the book that I actually haven't read, Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. I've tried it once, and it's hard to read old books because they're like, blah, 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 I'm old and it's hard. But I have 2 copies of this. I have this one and an annotated one. And so I will give it another attempt. I promise Darwin, I will do it because I love evolution. Thank you as always for watching. And thank you to Roots donors for supporting this channel. If you want to understand more about the past and how we got here, check out the previous videos here. And if you want to understand the future and where we're going, feel free to subscribe here. Hope to see you then. Bye.